Okay, so welcome and thank you for coming to this debate. This is Common Core, Defend, Bury, or Transform. I'm going to start out with, you might notice that I am not Valerie, who is the person that is in your program. I'm Lillian Mongeau, and I am from the Hechinger report. I'm the engagement editor there, and I also am the West Coast correspondent. So I cover everything from early ed to higher ed with a lot of Common Core in between. Also, I'd like to urge you to check out our extensive Common Core coverage. If after this debate you have additional questions, we can try to answer them. That's at hechingerreport.com. Okay, just my editor told me I had to say that. All right, we're going to be using Slido today. It's up here. You've probably seen this by now. You can sign in online or on your computer, on your phone. The hashtag is South by Southwest EDU. We're in Hilton, Salon H, Austin, Texas, but they don't ask you that part. We are here today with Mike Petrilli. He's the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institution, which is a think tank. He's also a research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute, which is another think tank. He is also the executive editor of Education Next, which is education news, and our direct competitor, really. We're a little better. No. No. Am I not supposed to be debating? Is that...
Lillian, that doesn't seem very objective here. But both of us have cowboy boots, so I do feel like you might be pulling for me after all.
The one, I don't know. Okay, and then our other debater here is John Katzman. He's the founder and CEO of Noodle, which is a website that will help you pick the most appropriate education service for yourself or your child. He's also the founder of the Princeton Review, which you might have heard of, and 2U. He's also a board member on the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the National Association of Independent Schools and the National Association of Public Charter Schools. So we've got two guys who've been in this for a long time and have a lot to say. But before I let them say anything, I have a question for you all. So again, the title is Defend, Bury, or Transform for the Common Core. So if your answer is defend, raise your hand. Okay. If your answer is bury, raise your hand. Okay, I'm only seeing one, two, okay, a few in the back. Okay, and if your answer is transform, raise your hand. All right, so that's the majority, really interesting. We're gonna ask that question again at the end and see how much it's changed. Okay, before we start with them, the agenda is basically gonna be, I'm gonna give a brief introduction. They're both going to get a chance to state their positions, and then we'll kind of go into a debate where I ask some questions, and at the end we'll have audience questions. My section is really just the facts. Like I said, I am a neutral reporter, and so I just want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page with what the Common Core is. So, for starters, it is a set of standards for what students are supposed to know and be able to do. So that means it's literally things like, and I know that a lot of you know this, so I'm going to try to go quickly, but I want to just make sure that everyone in the room understands the same basic things. So it could be, children will be able to count to 100. And then there's nothing in there about how you're supposed to get them to count to 100. There's a lot of curriculum that's been developed. There's a lot of schools working on how to do that, but the standards themselves don't have that. They just have the standard, which is the goal. I feel like I keep saying, I'm going to stop that now. It's not a federal mandate, though there has been argument that the Department of Education under the Obama administration made adopting the standards a requirement for a lot of the Race to the Top funding. And so, though it's not a federal mandate, there have been some carrots and sticks used to get people to adopt the Common Core. So that's sort of a touchy point. The Common Core is still mostly intact in about 40 states. In some of those states, it's changed somewhat significantly. In other states, it's changed, but not that much. And in some states, it's basically exactly what was originally adopted. There's also states like Texas and Nebraska that are adopting their own set of standards that are not Common Core. However, if you put the standards side by side, they're very similar to Common Core. So these standards are definitely kind of becoming the norm, even if there's a lot of debate over exactly what they should be. You heard probably about PARCC and SBAC. SBAC is also known as Smarter Balance. These are tests that have been developed to assess student performance on the standards. The idea of the test was to have comparable scores, but the tests so far are not very popular, and some states have already said they're going to stop using them. Other states pulled out even before they officially administered the first version. The tests are meant to be tougher and therefore more accurate to how likely kids who take it are, if you do well on the test, it's supposed to say, okay, they're actually going to be able to do well in college. That's the idea. Whether or not that's happened is definitely something people are debating right now. It's also worth noting that the Common Core didn't introduce the test. That was No Child Left Behind. There's a lot of debate. We get comments constantly on the website being upset about Common Core because of the testing, and it's certainly Common Core is being tested, but the tests have been around, and these tests are just new versions of standardized tests. Last two things, just to understand what this means for the classroom, the standards right now are only for English and math. There are next generation science standards which are separate from the Common Core and which some states have adopted, but they're technically not Common Core, though they're along the same lines of thinking, but they're technically not. So we're not going to be talking about science standards today. We're not going to be talking about social studies. We're just talking about English language and math. For ELA, the shift was to more complex texts, to more evidence-based writing. So that means if you want to say something about a book, you have to say, like, well, on page 3 it said X and that's why I'm concluding that this author thinks Y. Again, this is something that's been around, but that's what the standards are doing. There's also more nonfiction encouraged in the standards with the idea that that will give children better background knowledge, which the writers of the standards felt was lacking. In math, the big shifts are to fewer topics. So you cover fewer things in any given year. There's supposed to be more continuity from grade to grade, so the idea is that you build on a topic every year in a linear fashion, as opposed to like, well, we're going to do this topic one time, 1 year, and then you don't hear about it again until 3 grades later. That was the idea. And the math standards also are more focused on conceptual understanding than on sort of math facts. So those were the major shifts. So that's supposed to be just for you an overview of Common Core and where it's at. These guys have a lot more thoughts. And they have a lot of thoughts about whether it's working, and that's what we're going to get into now. So, John, we'll start with you. Defend, bury, or transform?
Transform. My argument is really pretty simple. Lillian, you're talking about the theory of Common Core. We've got to look at the actual thing itself. We need some way of holding educators accountable for outcomes, but the current Common Core approach is failing quickly and was designed in ways that pretty much guarantee that failure. Therefore, we can't bury it, but we can't defend it. We have to transform it. And a few things I should put out there from the start. I have no problem with standards in isolation. You know, standards can serve an important purpose, neutral agreements to collaborate. By calling skills a common name, it means that one of us can diagnose a weakness and other people can remediate. And that's fine. I get off the bus when someone decides that they know which standards are really important or unimportant for every student, and when we attach tests and high stakes to them. Common Core should be thought of, and for this debate, I would argue we should think of it as a system. It's not simply a list of standards. It is an approach to education reform. We can all agree sorry, I have a nasty cold. We can all agree we need a robust accountability system. If we can't measure which schools, textbooks, or apps are effective with which kids, we can't improve teaching and learning. The charter movement and the EdTech movement pride themselves on accountability, that we can help educate kids better. If you can't measure any of that, I think this entire movement is at risk. So the problem that Common Core was designed to solve is real, but the fact is the ship is sinking. And let me give you some numbers. First of all, people hate Common Core. 25% of parents at this point support it, 40% of teachers, and those numbers are sinking fast. In state after state, new leadership makes killing Common Core a priority. Of the 38 governors who have been inaugurated since Common Core was adopted, 17 have killed the standards or the tests or both. And that's not a process that's ebbing. It's continuing to pick up steam. The standards will fracture more. The tests will fracture more. When consortia like PARC were announced, the Department of Ed mandated that each would work with at least 15 states as part of its grant of $186 million per test. PARC is now in 7 states, and it's probably going to lose some of those. Anyone trying to defend Common Core may as well defend BlackBerry or New Coke. After an investment of $8 billion, Common Core is dying. Now, this was not simply a problem of implementation, it's a problem of theory. Everything we've seen since 2010 was predictable. So as we look to transform Common Core, we need to look at some errors in the underlying assumptions. First, the notion that every kid should learn the same thing at the same time, that one size fits all. And yes, there are countries that do that successfully, but they're a lot more homogeneous than we are. Like Finland they do a great job. We're not Finland, we're not Singapore. The second is that a small group of people can and should decide which standards are more important than other ones, which ones we should test, which ones we shouldn't. It's arrogant, especially in an age where neuroscientists are telling us that we're just in the foothills of figuring out what works in education. Third, the standards themselves shine a spotlight on various educators, but they themselves are behind the spotlight and invisible. Instead of an approach where standards compete with one another, where different approaches can be measured by the long-term outcomes against kids, since we're all using the same one, Common Core is itself utterly unaccountable. To that end, I'd like to propose to measure the impact of Common Core. While I don't think international test scores are particularly meaningful metrics, they're the metrics cited by Common Core proponents. So I'd push all the people like Mike who support Common Core to take this pledge, and I don't want to sound Trump-like here. We will you have to raise your hand. We will dramatically improve the international ranking of U.S. schools in the next 5 years, or Mike and his ilk will admit that they just caused an enormous, expensive mistake. By the way, we've done all of this Common Core stuff with, despite the fact that Common Core has no track record. The standards movement arguably has one successful implementation out of 50, and that's Massachusetts. But we didn't base the Common Core on Massachusetts standards. We started from scratch. So that's all theory. Let's talk about the flaws that made strong implementation impossible. First is this notion that we're going to use Common Core tests to grade teachers and fire lots of them. Of course, it was predictable that the teachers' union would oppose. And that's not an implementation problem. That's, again, entirely a predictable problem. To their credit, Gates Foundation in 2014 said, why don't we just delay judging teachers for 2 years? It's now 2016, so we'll see how that all plays out. Second, the notion that state rankings wouldn't lead to wide-scale abandonment. The plan was that every year, all the states that did poorly would be motivated to try harder next year. The reality is that every year, 49 states are going to have a pretty good reason to get rid of Common Core tests and adopt their own so that they couldn't be measured against other states. The notion that Common Core wouldn't narrow curriculum is widely disproven. Once a teacher has tested the tested standards, once she's taught the tested standards, she faces a choice. Teach other untested standards or things, or go back over the same stuff over and over again. And predictably and overwhelmingly, teachers choose the latter approach. That's not specific to Common Core. That was a problem with the state tests, but we need to fix it. Finally, Common Core tests are long. Thank you. Middle school Park takes 9 hours plus. Smarter Balance takes 6.5. And there's a lot of time spent waiting, sitting, moving, and shuffling. In New York, that's 19 hours last year taking the test per kid. And this is only one test out of several. You've got all the practice tests that the kids are taking. Plus, according to a study by the Council of Great City Schools, kids today take 112 standardized tests between kindergarten and 12th grade. Finally, the flaw we haven't hit yet. What's to keep the consortia from jacking up test scores in the same way that every state has? There's no reason to believe that people operating at the national level are far more honest than people operating at the state level. I think you're going to see exactly the same grade inflation. And by the way, as a test prep guy, it's pretty easy to do it. You just take the most popular wrong answer, the most popular distractor, and tweak it to make it a little less attractive. And you can take a question, same right answer, and make it way, way easier. So you've seen grade inflation in every state test. You're going to see it here too. So what can we do from here? We can't keep defending it because it's dying. We can't abandon it because we need accountability. We have to transform it. And I have a proposal for how to do so, but the answer is not to convince you of my excellent proposal. It is to set up a process where the stakeholders can get together and think this through and work towards a better solution. Common Core should help us create an education system that's excellent, accountable, flexible, and research-based. Let's transform it by addressing its glaring design problems and see if we can get there.
Okay, thanks. And we'll get back to your plan to transform in a minute. Next, Mike, defend, bury, transform.
All right. By the way, you see me up here with my phone. I have been following the Twitter stream, and somebody suggested we have a Hamilton-style rap contest as a part of this, and I think that's excellent. Maybe during the Q&A we can get to that. All right, so I'm obviously an optimist, and you can tell because here I am trying to grow my hair back again as one sign of my optimism. My kid, I've been shaving my head for years, and my kids want me to grow it out. Turns out it's harder than it used to be. Anyway, but so yes, I tend to see Common Core as a glass half full. What I want to say is this, that we need to both defend it and then, of course, transform it. But we do need to defend it, and it's worth defending because we have made important progress as a country over the last 10 years that is worth defending. And if we don't defend it and we lose important battles like we lost in Oklahoma, we lose real ground that matters for kids. Let me respond to a couple of things John said, and then I'll talk about the progress we've made. First of all, this idea that it's a sinking ship or that the attacks are picking up steam, it's just not true. Those of us that are out there in the trenches fighting this fight can tell you that things were very, very bleak back in, say, 2013 and 2014, when it really did look like every red state in the country was going to get out of Common Core. That's when I bought the cowboy boots for all my trips to, red state capitals. And the good news, to my view, was that it held, which was somewhat miraculous. It is true that we've lost a lot of states on the test, but as I'll mention in a minute, even those other states that don't use PARCC and Smarter Balanced have new tests and new higher cut scores. Every year, yes, we see some states floating bills to pull out. Right now, there's a debate in Kansas, one in West Virginia, and yet what we usually see is by the end of the legislative session, those bills have died. So, the Common Core, again, somewhat miraculously, has stood the test of time politically in 40-plus states, which is pretty remarkable. And by the way, if we want to throw teacher evaluations into this thing, I'm totally with John on this one. I think it was a huge mistake to tie teacher evaluations to the test scores, particularly when we did. That was not a part of the Common Core agenda, in my view. All right, so what is the progress that's so worth defending? Let's not forget, if you go back 10 years from now, let's say 2006, what did we have? In most states, we had very low standards or standards that were incredibly vague. You would go and try to read these standards, and you could not make sense of them. They were clearly written by a committee. Anytime they got to a tough decision, they would just sort of fuzzy it up, and so they weren't very useful guides, right? Or if they were clear, they were set at pretty low levels. You also had tests that everybody hated, and for good reason. They overwhelmingly were low-level, fill-in-the-blank tests. These tests tended to, if they tested any of the standards, they only tested the low-level standards. They were not very cognitively demanding. And so, as a result, when teachers felt pressured to teach to those tests, they were teaching to very low-level tests and low-level kinds of instruction. We also weren't telling the truth to parents. Because the tests were so easy, we had a situation where kids every year would take the state test, and they would get a report back from the state saying, congratulations, your child's proficient. What we weren't good at was telling them that proficient actually just meant that you had minimal basic skills in math and reading. You sure weren't on track for what was going to come next in terms of college or career, and thus we had the situation where millions of kids go through our system, graduate, get good grades, and land in remedial education. A study a few weeks ago from a higher ed institute that found that 40% of the kids in remedial education at community college campuses received an A average in high school, right? This is the challenge of low standards that we had, right? And we had these accountability systems under No Child Left Behind that didn't make any sense, that were unfair, that were punitive to schools that had a lot of low-income kids, and that incentivized everybody to just get the low-performing kids over this very low bar, all right? That focused all of our attention on those bubble kids, right? So it was a mess, all right? We had standards-based reform, but it was a mess. Now, where are we today? Almost every state in the country has much higher standards. They're clear. Of course, they're not perfect, and they will need to be improved. But they are a reasonable attempt at trying to say, based on the evidence we do have, here's what we think kids need to know and be able to do to be ready for college and be able to, and not end up in remedial education. In either on a four-year college campus or at a technical college. We have dramatically better tests. We at Fordham a few weeks ago came out with a huge new study. I encourage you to check it out, where we evaluated PARCC and Smarter Balance and ACT Aspire. They are all very high-quality tests. Not surprisingly, PARCC and Smarter Balance do a better job matching the content of the Common Core. They were designed to do so. The ACT people admit that that was not their purpose when they set out. But much higher quality, very cognitively demanding tests, not just fill in the blank, much more interesting. Now, more writing, that takes longer for the kids to do, and it takes longer to score, but better tests, so that if teachers are teaching to the test, they're teaching to much better tests, as we have promised them for a long time. And finally, under the new federal law, ESSA, a chance to do accountability in a much more thoughtful way, a much bigger focus on growth over time, focus on all kids, and look at things beyond test scores, but to look at other indicators of student success and school quality. In my mind, those are huge changes. And so unless we're ready to abandon standards-based reform, we have to say that this has been a big success in building a new infrastructure for that. One other goal that we had was to hope that all of this was going to lead to better classroom materials. That is a work in progress, right? But to challenge the textbook oligopoly. But look what's happened out there. You have new startups in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors developing instructional materials, digital textbooks. You've got the Engage New York website with things like Eureka Math that by some estimates are now reaching something like 20%, 30% of the teachers nationwide, right? More popular outside New York than inside New York, and for free, right? The kinds of things that you just couldn't do before we had those common standards. So my argument is, do not go back. Of course it's not a panacea, and of course we now need to take the next step, which is to say there are limits to what we can do with policy, with standards and accountability and testing, and we have to get back to a new focus on how do we help educators nationwide improve their classroom practice. I think, again, Common Core and the related reforms set a good framework for it, but they don't make it actually happen. Now we got to do the real work of saying, what do we do to identify innovative practices, effective practices, and get them into the hands of teachers across the country?
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. I'm going to have a quick follow-up question for both of you, but I just want to say we want to leave half of the time here. We've got this time in front of us, half of the time for the next section. So, John, for you, you say it needs to transform. What's your transformation plan?
So, sorry. And again, this is, every complex question has a simple answer that's wrong. And so I'm not going to propose something simple, but I'll give you an outline. One of the problems for these tests, the reason that they're so long, is that you're trying to measure a broad set of standards across a whole bunch of grade levels with enough items at each one to be reliable. And tests like NAEP and PISA solve this by giving each student only 1/10 of the test. They're matrix tests. So you give it to 2,000 kids in a state or a country, and effectively you're getting 200 test takers. By trying to measure each student, obviously that approach, you can measure an institution, you can't measure a kid. So by trying to measure each student with the same instrument that we're trying to measure our entire education system, we've ended up forcing very, very long tests. And as state bail from the consortia tests into shorter ones like SAT and ACT, you go back to a shorter test, but you lose the ability to measure the schools in any kind of accurate way. So my solution is we keep the standards, but we kill the tests, including PARCC and Smarter Balance. We say to curriculum providers and to networks like KIPP, you set your philosophy, you set your curriculum, you tell us what you're trying to teach and hold kids accountable for it in the way that you think is important. Your final exam that everybody's taking is lockstep with your curriculum. In other words, they're part of the same process, thought process, and that's what colleges do. It's what folks like General Assembly do. What are we trying to do, and let's measure it. Now, let's focus on measuring the curricular approaches and the networks. And let's try to measure it by authentic metrics like dropout rates and graduation rates and performance in college, and look at real things we care about to see which approaches are working well with each kid. And to the degree that we need something even quicker, let's use matrix tests like TIMSS and PISA against the people using a curricular approach. Now you start getting, this is an A+ approach, this is a B- approach. And then the final part is actually pretty simple. You curve each group's tests to whatever the grade is of that curricular approach. If KIPP schools are an A, then the average kid must be an A. If the McGraw-Hill approach to K-6 is averaging a B+, then the average kid must be a B+. And that takes away the incentive to dumb down the tests. So I could go on for an hour, but I think the key is there are other solutions. We don't have to just give up and say, if we want standards, we have to stick with one-size-fits-all.
All right, and what do you think? You said there were some transformations you would make and some changes, some adjustments. Where do you think we should go from where we are right now?
Sure. So the way I tend to think about the challenge that we have in our education system is, on the one hand, there's the challenge for our low-income kids today. And on the other hand, there's the broader student population. We've all seen the charts, and we certainly have been reminded again by the current presidential campaign that we have some enormous divides in this country, right? And that the economic divides in this country are getting bigger. And the experiences that low-income kids are having in their childhoods, in their homes, in their communities, are getting more and more different from the experiences of more affluent kids, right? And that's why we see achievement gaps getting worse by income, not getting better. So the challenge of helping low-income kids catch up and have a shot at making it into the middle class is getting harder and harder, and is one that, in my view, is going to take phenomenal schools in order for it to work. That a little bit better isn't going to do it. And when I look at our traditional public school system and I ask, is it capable of producing phenomenal schools at scale? My own view is no. I mean, especially look at the big urbans. I look at maybe DC public schools gives me some hope. People now point to Miami-Dade as making a lot of progress. Where else? Where I do see the progress is certainly in the charter sector, in the high-quality, high-performing charter sector, where you do see schools that are breaking the curve, and not just on test scores, but on those long-term things that John's talking about. College completion, a KIPP, where the latest data showed that 45% of their students, their low-income students, were making it 2 and through 4-year degrees, which is in the neighborhood of 4.5 to 5 times better than what you usually get for low-income kids. So, I think that it would be naive for us to think that simply standards or even some curriculum reforms was going to be enough to help low-income kids surmount the huge challenges they're facing today. Now, there's going to be a lot of places in this country untouched by charter schools, even in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and particularly out in the suburbs and out in the small towns and in rural America. And there, I think we do have to help their educators do everything we can to give them better tools. I love the idea that John had of testing better products and better ways of doing this, and helping them see what is working and what is not. I would love to have a conversation about why things like the What Works Clearinghouse haven't worked so far to drive better practice at the local level or push the field better towards evidence-based practice. But again, I think that you need a structure. You need an overall accountability system. And I think the standards with tests that are aligned to them give schools at least a head start on a direction of which way to go. But they're just the beginning, and we need all this other stuff too.
They're not a head start. They're handcuffs. This is how you have to teach kids. And the promises you're making are the promises made by NCLB 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, 15, and the accountability movement overall 30 years ago. We've continued to slip in international rankings since the start of the accountability movement. At some point, you have to stop just doubling down and hoping that finally you'll come up well in poker or roulette. Like, this isn't a good strategy. We need a different strategy.
So Well, let me respond to that very, very quickly.
I have questions too. Just,
Okay.
Yeah.
You want in?
Go ahead.
Well, let me just say, look, I think we have to look at the whole big picture. We have made tremendous progress for the lowest performing kids over the last 20 years. If you look at the lowest performing and the poorest and minority kids, at least at the 4th and 8th grades, they are doing math at 2 to 3 grade levels ahead of where their peers were 20 years ago. That's huge progress. And it makes sense because everything has been focused, all the accountability has been focused on making sure that low-performing kids got over a low proficiency bar. It was that No Child Left Behind. So that did work, and the question now is whether we can use a similar strategy to move the student population as a whole, certainly to make progress at the middle and also at the top. And I'll agree, that's a big question mark, but we made huge progress, and you see that in the international data too, which is why that compared to poor kids around the world, our poor kids actually do better than many poor kids around the world because of this focus over the last 20 years.
Okay. We're going to stop it there for a minute. I think we have a good idea where you guys both have your baseline. So we're going to ask some additional questions here. One of them is taking a step back. So I'm a reporter. I'm an education reporter. At Hechinger Report, we get into classrooms. That's how we think it's best to do this kind of thing, because you can spend all day at the state legislature with people yelling at each other. And when I talk to teachers about the Common Core, most of them they're vaguely against it because it's changing a practice that they have well set up. They're almost entirely neutral, or they're vaguely for it because they like the conceptual focus of the new standards. But I don't have people reacting super strongly. They say to me, standards have been around for a long time now. They're not new. We're used to teaching to standards. They tell me testing is not new. Testing's been around for, standardized. A lot of them think there should be less standardized testing, but it's not like the Common Core brought it in. Teachers tend to understand that. And also a lot of the teaching methods that they're using to get to these new standards aren't actually new either. I remember being taught math this way in the 80s in Boston. So I guess my question is, and this is my editor's favorite question about every story we propose, why should we care? Why should we be so upset, or why should we be so excited about the Common Core?
First of all, teachers are not neutral, right? Overwhelmingly, they're against. And the number that are against is rising every year, not declining. That's just the Gallup numbers. But second, the reason we care is that we've spent $8 billion so far on this. We've distracted. This movement is a distraction from things that are actually more effective. We've got to improve our education system. We can't just keep doing the same thing or better versions of the same thing and hope for different results. I think education is important, and I think these are enormous initiatives with a lot of money behind them. And the question isn't, should we do this or nothing? The question is, should we do this, or should we at least try different approaches to see if we get better outcomes?
So, John keeps claiming that this is a handcuff, that it's getting in the way of innovation. I don't know. I haven't seen it. I'd like to hear maybe in the questions. A lot of times I hear from entrepreneurs in this space, that say, hey, having common standards across states allows us to get into this market much easier and compete against the big companies than in the past, where we had to customize everything 50 times over. Look, I think that the teachers you're talking to, I think in some cases it's true that they were teaching this ways. In other times, if you drill down, what you see is that, everybody wants to believe that they were already doing this stuff, but maybe they're not actually teaching to the Common Core. And that's why we have this moment right now. We've just had one cycle of Common Core testing. And as everybody gets those test scores back and really starts to look at it, I'll be curious. It'll just be interesting as a reporter to see if it has any aha moments for people to say, I thought I was really in track, but my kids really bombed this part, and I've gone back and realized I didn't. I really didn't quite get it. I'll give you an example. On English language arts, the standards are very clear to say that the only way this is going to work is if you teach a content-rich curriculum in the early grades. That, along with teaching kids how to decode the language, little kids are going to get better at reading if they learn history and if they learn science and art and music. It's the E.D. Hirsch argument that we've had for 30 years, and that has been proven to be right by cognitive science. And yet, go into classrooms. Do you see people teaching more history and science and art and music in kindergarten and first and second grade? I don't. Now, there's a handful of places. A couple of charter school networks are getting religion on that. You see KIPP moving in that direction, Achievement First, some others, but a lot of places. And so I do think there's people who just honestly think that they're teaching to the Common Core and may not be, and that's why having aligned high-quality assessments to serve as a check are important. And here we are. I'm also curious, why is this a big deal? Maybe it's not, but how are parents responding now that they're being told for the first time that actually your kid's not on track for college and career readiness? I mean, again, this is just an open question. Are they ignoring that news? Are they rationalizing it? When they go to the school to ask about it, how does the teacher respond? Do they say, don't worry about the test? These are all open questions. I mean, if you want to say, how long have we really been doing Common Core? I would argue that the whole kit and caboodle, if you include the tests, is we just started last spring with the first round of test admissions, and now this fall with getting the test scores back. And I think this is the ripe time to find out, is it changing parents? Is it views? Is it changing teachers' practice? I don't know. I'm certainly hoping to, and I think it's worth defending it long enough to give it a chance to do some good.
Yeah, and we're going to cover the test a little more. And I should say my sample size, obviously, is very small and not scientific for teacher reactions, but I have heard that from a number of people. Okay, so again, with the classroom, getting into the classroom, I would love for both of you to tell me about one standard or teaching practice that's new because of the Common Core and that you have seen either helping or hurting in the classroom.
Yeah, this is tricky because it's all, you start wandering into religion. One of the changes in Common Core that I think is most interesting is the movement from fiction to nonfiction. And there are a lot of people here who would say, no, we were way too heavy on fiction, we're doing the right thing. But for my kid, fiction might be great because it got him reading and it got him excited about coming to school and it got him excited about books. And the notion that we are going to decide that your kid is better off reading more nonfiction, I just have a problem with. And it's less about overall, is it good or bad, and more about why are you telling me, that every kid is the same?
So who do you think should get to make the decision about what your kid's reading? You or the teacher or the school? Like, where does that decision point happen?
I think the notion of there are various approaches. In preschools, there are Reggio schools and Montessori schools and more traditional. And you as a parent are choosing schools that fit you better. The charter movement is all about fit. What's the right approach for my kid? And I think that's where it's exciting. Like, there's a network. It's chosen to do it a certain way, and people are drawn to that or they're not drawn to that.
Yeah, and John, I totally agree on the charter movement. And in fact, most leaders of the charter movement, including, I think you're on the board still, the National Alliance, strongly supports the Common Core, right? And so these things don't have to be conflicting with one another. You can allow lots of different ways of getting there, different approaches. But if you believe in accountability and testing, then you got to decide what's going to be on the test. How many of those English questions are going to be fiction and how many are going to be nonfiction? So I don't think you can get away from that.
No, you don't. And that is my whole point. To get accountability, you don't need to have one size fits all. And when we conflate the two and make that the choice, then as a charter guy, yeah, I have to be in favor of accountability. We have to be able to measure schools. I'm just saying that's a false choice.
All right, so what else, if you want to measure school quality, and you're going to use tests as part of that, you're saying that allow there to be 2 or 3 different tests you could choose from rather than just one. Is that what you're getting at? Let's say for an elementary school.
It could be 50 different tests. It could be that the McGraw-Hill curriculum measures its final, the people using that curriculum get measured against a certain battery of tests. It could be that Engage New York has a battery of tests that it buys into. The key is that the people doing the curriculum and the people doing the tests should be the same people. Like, what are we trying to do, and let's measure it. And then measure them. How is your approach working?
Okay, so this gets into my last section here, which is on the tests. And I think the tests have been particularly contentious among everybody. So far, as has been mentioned a couple times, the tests have mostly been administered twice. There was like a test of the test and then last year's official test. So we haven't really seen growth from from like this year to next year. That hasn't happened yet. So it's a little hard to say, it's a little hard to measure much there. So far, as reporters, we had to say, here were some scores. Ta-da! And we know nothing about what it means about growth. But I just wanted to put that in as an aside. So what I'm going to do next, before we get into the defending or supporting certain arguments, I want to see where you guys stand on a couple things. You guys have told me a few times that you agree on some things, so I wanted to see if maybe there are some spots of agreement here. So I'm going to give you a statement, and you're just going to tell me if you agree or disagree with it. And then you are going to have time to defend yourself, so you don't have to do that right now. Okay. First statement. The PARCC test accurately assesses students' grasp of grade level standards.
Agreed. Read our study, John.
I have. Agreed.
Okay. The Smarter Balance test accurately assesses student level grasp of grade level standards.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Is it possible, and maybe the answer, since your last answer was yes, the answer may be yes here too, but this is a question people have been asking. Do you think it's possible for a standardized test to accurately assess student grasp of standards? Is there one standardized test that can do that?
Is there one? I mean, look,
Is it possible to create a standardized test that accurately does? Because some people say you can't really do this on a standardized test.
Right. You definitely have to make trade-offs, right? It is impossible to cover every single standard unless you have kids taking a test for 36 hours in a row, and they're already plenty long. So you do have to make trade-offs. And the trick, in our opinion, is that you have to figure out what's the major work of each grade, what are the most important standards, and then do your best to stay faithful to those.
Okay. But you agree that a test can assess some set of standards?
Yeah, and we did this big review that we just did of PARCC and Smarter Balanced and ACT Aspire, and they are impressive. And look, we've been very critical of the Obama administration on a lot of things, as a conservative group, you look at, oh my God, here's the federal government's going to fund these states to build these tests. It's going to be a complete debacle. And they've certainly had challenges politically, but we got to give them credit. Both of those groups built damn good tests that,
okay,
by all accounts, look to be much better than what states were using before.
Okay, and that was a slightly longer answer, so go ahead.
Both of those groups spent $200 million doing it for the 7 kids who are going to end up taking those tests. So, sure. Look.
So just to be, you think it is possible for a test to assess standards?
If we decide that every kid should learn the same thing at the same time, and if we decide to give a 30-hour-long test for every kid, yes, you can measure if they learn those standards that you think are really important.
Okay.
I think it's the wrong question, but yes.
Okay. Last statement. It is important for states to be able to compare test result data with each other.
At what level? The state level, district, kid, school?
Let's say state.
Well, we've got NAEP, and I think that's important to still have that. Although all of our friends on Twitter sphere always give us a hard time if we try to draw any conclusions from the NAEP. We are accused of misnapery, so then I'm not sure what it's for. But I don't think that the commonality from state to state, be able to compare this school in Montana to this school in Massachusetts, would have been nice for researchers. It's certainly not essential.
Okay, and what do you think, John?
What we really care about is which is the right school for your kid, right? That's what's really important. And these tests give parents almost no information that's useful. I had a stack of papers from one state, and I asked the head of accountability in the state, so which school should I send my kid to? Here's your data. And he's like, I don't know, it depends. And for all the money we're spending on accountability, it doesn't answer the critical question. Very few parents are deciding between a school in Montana and a school in New Jersey, so no.
Okay. Great, well that was really helpful. I think I was going to have you guys do closing statements and then go to questions, but I think I'm going to have you do closing statements at the end because some of these questions are really interesting and I think they might inform your closing. So the top question here that a lot of people have thumbs up and I also find really fascinating is, would Common Core by any other name smell as sweet? So basically the question is, how much are the political issues versus the actual conceptual deficiencies responsible for the current debacle that some consider Common Core?
Yeah, it's, on the right, and I think we have to talk about this, there's a lot of resistance on the political right, and there's some resistance on the political left. On the political right, where I have personally been much more focused, I would argue that 90% at least has been about the federal role. That was certainly what got the backlash started, and that's what's given it most of its energy. And as a conservative, I understand. I mean, there's been a very touchy subject for a long time that you do not want the federal government dictating the curriculum that kids are learning. And even though it was a limited federal role with Race to the Top, it happened. And I think that was another huge mistake. You see what is going on with the next generation science standards, which on its face should be much more controversial. There is evolution in there and climate change caused by humans. And those have been issues in some states. But do you hear the presidential candidates talking about it? Do you see it on the front pages all the time? No, because there's been no federal role with those standards.
So first of all, these really are deficiencies. Again, and it's not just the standards, it's the tests. The science standards aren't controversial because they don't come with a national science test that every kid has to take. So if the Common Core were, called Tom Brady, it would still be as unpopular. It's a problem thing.
What if it was
Are you
called
trying
Donald
to say
Trump?
there's something about cheating here? I don't, that's not...
If it was called Donald Trump, it would be really popular. Okay, I'm realizing that when I scroll, you don't see down there, so I'm asking questions that are on here that not everyone can see, but it's a good question. So I believe this is coming from a teacher based on the way it's written, but it says, isn't abandoning the Common Core at this point just another example of pulling the rug out from under teachers? So it's an open-ended question.
Yeah, I'm not proposing abandoning Common Core. I'm proposing a process to evolve it into something that is better than it is. And I think that's really supporting teachers.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, transform it. So, to me, it would say, well, do you leave them in place or not? Do you leave the tests in place or not? Are we going to keep grading schools based in part on these test scores? And by the way, of course, in the real world, the answer to all those things is yes. We have a new federal law that still requires standards and testing and accountability, and that's going to have another shot at this in 5 years if they renew it on time.
Okay. Another question. Over 50% of students in some New York school districts are boycotting Common Core tests. We've reported on that a good amount at the Hechinger report. So the question is, if students are this upset about it and they're rejecting it, can you still defend it?
We're going to let kids decide this one? I know that there's people here, South by Southwest, you might be all touchy-feely about, empowering kids, but let's be careful about that road. I think when you look at places where there's a lot of opting out happening, I think we got to understand what's going on there. I think there's some legitimate concerns. I do understand if you are a high school junior and you're taking the SAT and the ACT and AP classes, and now there's some new state test you're supposed to take, and you don't really have to, and it doesn't count, why you wouldn't want to take that test. Totally get that. All right, and we need to figure that piece out. But, different than, these parents that say, oh, poor Susie doesn't like to take this test, and I just say, look, I'm a public school parent. I get it. You guys are all paying for my kid to go to school. And there's a bargain as a part of that, which means, that there's got to be some accountability to the taxpayers. Now, if it's overboard, if we're turning around every minute and there's a test, that's a problem. But one test at the end of the year, hey, for my kids' free public education, I think that's a reasonable bargain.
Mike's right. We know better than kids. We know better than parents. We know better than teachers. We know better than principals. We should impose our beliefs about what everybody should be learning on everybody, no matter what they say or do.
Yes, that's exactly what I said, John.
Excellent
Look,
summary.
the funny thing is, of course, that if you take some of this stuff seriously, like we're going to move away from testing, or we're going to let everybody choose their own test, the main groups that have a real problem with that, John, as you know, are not on the right. They're to my left and probably your left. They're the civil rights groups who say, hey, you go back to that, what you have is a situation where we're going to go back to having lower standards for poor kids than that we have for affluent kids. And, a lot of times it's the affluent kids that are pulling out, and there's part of this argument that says, look, suck it up, take the test, because this data is helping us improve the system for everybody. And it's particularly important that we be able to know about achievement gaps that are out there. And so it's a civic duty. It's not to say that we're telling you that we know best or but it is saying that you have a civic responsibility. We're trying to get transparent information about our schools. If you want to use the public schools, we're just asking you to do your civic duty and take the damn test.
This is not a civic duty. It's just bad design. Look, the problems Common Core is trying to solve are real. This stuff is hard. It's a simple but wrong solution to those problems. And you're just going to continue to try to push it on people. And it hasn't worked in virtually every state we've tried it, and it's not working here. And I'm just saying, I'm trying to help and saying, I hope all of you are trying to help and say, if we keep walking down this road, we're going to go over a cliff. So why don't we try to figure out kind of a change in direction and steer this thing a little bit better? Like, these are real problems. You're right.
Yeah, no, and I agree, John. But all I hear from you is the only thing I can really concrete is what? Allow lots of different tests. So we don't have to have every kid taking the same test anymore. And I think that's an interesting proposal. I'm willing to look at that, right? But again, you're going to hear from the civil rights groups the reason they made sure that would not be legal under the federal law is that they're worried that that means going to be lower standards for poor kids.
First of all, my proposal is to kind of flip the model and start with the curriculum and make it a piece with the tests. One of the problems with Common Core, as I've mentioned, is it a curriculum or is it not a curriculum? And depending on who you're talking to on which day, you get very, very different answers. The solution that I'm proposing, by no means the only possible way of fixing this problem, just points that we should have the conversation. We should try to address the problems you're talking about with more creative solutions before this thing tanks.
Okay, we've got another question here that I also hear a lot in the classroom and in schools. These tests are not designed to provide feedback quickly, so teachers aren't getting feedback on their kids that they have in class when they have them in class. Is that a problem that either of you have heard proposed solutions to, or is that not what these tests are supposed to do?
Yeah, no, that's a real issue. I do think it's going to go a lot faster than last year. It couldn't go any slower. Good God. People getting things back in November. I think Smarter Balance, being a computer adaptive assessment, has some potential to get some feedback back very quickly. I think Parks, the stuff that Park did on the computer, again, should be able to get back more quickly. But they may never be able to solve this problem. If you'll remember, the original design, at least for Park, was that they were going to have these interim assessments to give better feedback to teachers right away, and that some of those results would roll up into the summative. But the concern was, and I think this was an important concern, was, oh my God, at that point, you're going to have a national test every quarter. You're really going to be driving the scope and sequence and curriculum in a way that's pushing everybody in the same direction, and so they pulled back. So it's a trade-off, and you see providers coming into the market. Certainly saw the iReady people here today to try to fill that void with other tests. But then you have the trade-off of even more standardized tests.
When you're trying to have one set of tests do everything, I want to measure the state, the school, the teacher, the kid. I want to give results back quickly, but have the whole thing kind of be agile. I want to test frequently, but only test once a year. You end up with, pardon me, the shit show that we have. And we've got to decide what we're trying to do and let each piece do that by itself. We can't come out with a unified solution here. It's not doable, and I can step you through the math.
John, what shit show? I mean, yes, we all know there's been huge political backlash, and there are places where the opt-out movement has been big. I think you live in one of those places, and you might have, just a skewed perspective. I mean, you live in New York, the one blue state that has had a huge opt-out movement. There's a few other pockets in Washington State and a few other places. Certainly you've had political backlash on the right, but, we heard Lillian say you go into schools and people kind of shrug. They're like, yeah, they're standards.
Mike, when Park launched, it had 26 states. And you, in your report on Park, used the phrase economies of scale 13 times to describe how terrific this approach was. It's now at 7, and it's probably going to lose 2 of those in the next 6 months. This is falling apart. You're just whistling past the graveyard.
Well, I guess it depends on what the it is. And look, you're right on assessments. I wish that more states had stuck with Park because it turned out to be a great test. They now have a chance where states that didn't stick with Park can purchase items from Park. I hope that some do so. And I hope that some other people look at the tests in the other states and all of your states and find out if they're any good. They are at least more honest than they used to be because the cut scores are dramatically higher. That's a big victory.
All right, one more question. We're going to take a step back a little bit from Common Core here, but I thought this was really interesting. The question is, if SAT and ACT scores don't predict success in college, and if high PISA scores have an inverse relationship to entrepreneurship, are standard-based metrics obsolete? Should we not be talking about standards at all?
There is a point to accountability, but I don't think the standards approach, one group of people creating standards, a second group of people, and then, by the way, quitting, right? Like, the standards group is disbanded. There's no ongoing effort to improve these things. We're done. We've now figured out what every kid should learn. We'll talk to you in a couple decades. Then a second group creating the tests, and then third and fourth groups trying to create curricula, teaching the stuff that's being measured by the test against those standards. That approach is failing, and yeah, the SAT and ACT fail for many of the same reasons. This approach to accountability, I think we've kind of played it out.
Look, first of all, tell me if this is wrong. I mean, the SAT and ACT still have predictive power about how students do in college. They are tools, and they are much more predictive if you combine it with grades, right? But, I mean, there's this debate to say, you know, that if you get rid of them entirely, again, you're stuck with no standards, which is that different high schools have different, you know, ways of grading papers, and you got the kids coming, and particularly from inner city schools where, you know, kids are getting an A where they'd get a C in a different school, and so that's a real challenge, right? That's a real problem. I mean, remember, SAT and ACT at the beginning were meant to make our system more equitable, more of a meritocracy, more of a chance for people who may be coming from, you know, tough neighborhoods or tough schools to show what they've got. Look, it's certainly the case that these standards are not going to encapsulate all of what it makes to be a successful human being or to go on and to do well in college or to do well in life. Of course not, right? We know that as parents, right? It's trying to get, in this case, a piece. You know, the reading, writing, and math skills that you need to be on track, right? And I think that we are better having standards than not having them. We're better if they're higher quality standards than if they're lower quality standards. But of course, we need a lot of other stuff too to fill in the blanks.
All right.
First of all, I just have to answer that. First of all, there's a 0.3 correlation between SAT and ACT scores and first-year grades in college. It is wild. We're spending $1 billion a year to get almost no predictive data as to kids' college performance. So yeah, it's predictive a little, but hardly worth the trip. Second, it's not a binary choice. Getting rid of the ACT and SAT doesn't necessarily mean replacing it with nothing but grades, because that's problematic as well. And finally, again, when you're defending this stuff, you're defending the theory, not the reality of Common Core, and not the reality of the SAT and ACT. And I really want to look at the practice, and that's why I speak a lot about the tests.
Okay, I was going to give you both a minute to close, but it's closer to 45 seconds. So let's start with you, Mike.
All right. Well, so I would just say, first of all, wherever you are in your states, if there is still a big fight going about just keeping this Common Core standards or doing what Oklahoma did and going back and starting over again and going back to old standards and old tests, I would urge you to stand and fight, because these standards are worth fighting for, and these better tests are worth fighting for. And then, full stop, what can we do to encourage better classroom practice, stronger curriculum as we move forward? That's, I think, where the next phase goes.
When we stop talking about how can schools be better and how can teachers be better, and we start talking about how do we get better at accountability and how do we improve our process, that's when things will get really exciting. As long as we can just sit here behind the spotlight and just whine about how the schools really aren't doing a very good job, I think we're just talking at each other.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody. Before we go, I am going to ask the question one more time. First, can you raise your hand if you changed your mind about something during this debate? We didn't change anybody's mind. Nobody changed their mind. Not a single, I don't see a single hand. No, it doesn't have to be that you changed your mind about everything, but like, did you change your mind about one single aspect? Okay.
It's just like the presidential election.
One person. Yep. 2 people. All right. Few there. All right. If you're still defend, raise your hand. Okay. If you're still, what was the other one? Bury. If you're still bury, raise your hand. And if you're for transform, raise your hand. Okay. All right. Interesting. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lillian.